Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining this one-hour webinar organized by Climate Policy Initiative and the EU REDD facility of the European Forest Institute. My name is Adeline Dontenville and I work for the EU REDD facility. Together with my colleague Angela Falconer from CPI, we're going to present to you today the methodological approach that our organizations developed to help countries and their partners better understand investments affecting forests. This approach is based on CPI's global climate finance tracking work and country experiences in Africa and Asia. It is now packaged into a set of standardized guidelines called the Land Use Finance Tool, freely available online. This webinar will provide you with an overview of this tool, which you can tailor to your own needs. So today we'll start off our agenda looking first at what is land use finance mapping, why use such an approach, and some examples. Angela will then continue by presenting the land use finance tool and what are the main steps involved in this type of analysis. We'll end up with some time for questions and answers. You will find this chat box, which you are already using to introduce yourself, in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Please, during the webinar, type in your questions and we will gather them and address them during the Q&A session. So let me first start by explaining why this topic is important. Land use change and forestry represent up to a quarter of global emissions and up to 75% of emissions in tropical forest countries. The land use change and forestry, LULUCF, sector represents 25% of committed emissions reductions in NDCs, second only to the energy sector. Yet CPI recorded in 2015-2016 that out of the 215 billion of international climate finance committed on average annually, only around 4%, or $9 billion US, was allocated to land use. In addition, analysis by Climate Focus tracking progress towards the New York Declaration on Forests goals highlighted the dominance of business-as-usual finance when it comes to even larger and more influential domestic agricultural subsidies and private on-farm investments. In this context, the challenge for REDD+ countries is twofold. Firstly, it is about mobilizing new finance for forest and climate goals, but secondly, it is also about aligning existing public and private investments to climate and forest objectives. Improving the understanding of land use investments is a key step towards effectively planning and implementing forest and climate commitments. Countries can benefit from taking a critical look at their current spending to realize efficiencies, as well as making the case for accessing new sources of finance. This analysis can be done through a land use finance mapping exercise. The diagram that you can see now on your screen is an example of visualization of land use finance mapping. It is called the Sankey diagram. It is one of the visual tools that can be used to convey the main results of this kind of analysis to a broad audience. Finance mapping is a quantitative as well as a qualitative analysis of the life cycle of public and potentially also private financial flows. So if we look at this diagram starting from left to right, the land use finance approach typically allows to break down actors by sources of funding, including public actors such as governments, their agencies, or development finance institutions, as well as potentially private sources, such as banks, investors, funds, corporations, households, or project developers. Moving towards the right, it then takes the analysis to instruments through which land use finance is channeled, such as grants and different forms of debt and equity. Flows are then mapped down to beneficiaries and disbursement channels, into specific uses in terms of specific sectors or measures supported. In this standardized example that you can see on the screen, flows are mapped into different measures related to mitigation, adaptation, and the enabling environment for REDD+ implementation. These flows represent the volume of finance, and the colors that you can see on the screen illustrate qualitative filters. So in this case, in this specific case, the green flows represent finance investments that are aligned to forest and climate objectives, and the gray flows represent flows that are potentially driving deforestation. So why map land use finance flows? The land use finance tool can support countries to understand the existing landscape of land use finance and provide an analytical base to support better planning, alignment, and resource mobilization. These three strategic uses help answer the following key challenges in land use. What are the main financing gaps, opportunities, and priorities to implement forest and climate objectives? How to align unsustainable investments to forest and climate objectives? How much money has been spent on reducing deforestation over time? So firstly, identifying and analyzing financial flows related to land use can help understand what action related to REDD+ objectives and policies is taking place and where. In addition, the analysis of the actors and financial mechanisms involved will help identify investment gaps, blockages, or new opportunities for incentive mechanisms. Data from land use finance mapping can be used to highlight funding gaps to reach policy objectives or targets. It can therefore make the case for new or scaled-up interventions targeting specific actors, using specific instruments in specific sectors or activities. For example, Vietnam used the land use finance tool to map investments in land use at subnational level in one region, the Central Highland region, covering 5 provinces. It looked at public, domestic, and international investments planned for the period from 2016 to 2020 to see to what extent they may contribute to the implementation of the National REDD+ Action Plan. So Vietnam quantified planned sources of REDD+ funding and main financing gaps to achieve the objectives of their REDD+ Action Plan by 2020 in order to inform funding proposals, including to the Green Climate Fund. The study also looked at broader land use finance, not only REDD+ finance, and its potential negative impact on forests, to identify opportunities to green investments, and as well as integrating forest safeguards into the new planning law. Secondly, the tool can also help identify and track financial flows which are driving deforestation, if that angle is included in the study. This type of analysis can provide strategic information for interministerial and cross-sectoral coordination and efforts to mainstream climate objectives in planning and better resource coordination amongst partners. For example, Côte d'Ivoire mapped public investments in land use for the year 2015, considering both investments aligned to REDD+ objectives, which are the ones you can see in the green flows in the diagram, the Sankey diagram on the screen, and investment not aligned to REDD+ objectives, and which might potentially be driving deforestation or increasing the pressure on forests. These are illustrated by the gray flows on the screen. Côte d'Ivoire found that 67% of domestic land use investments, as well as 87% of international donor land use investments, were not aligned to forest and climate objectives. And you can see that reflected by the thickness of those gray flows compared to the green ones. Results served as a basis to inform interministerial discussions on REDD+ implementation, and it was also used by the Ministry of Planning to initiate the mainstreaming of forests into the planning process. Thirdly, the tool can be used to generate baseline information to monitor the progress in mobilization or redirection of resources. It can also improve accountability through periodic tracking and increase transparency by providing publicly available data used for international and national reporting requirements. Indonesia was the first tropical country to map public expenditure in 2014. This mapping, which focused on all climate finance, so not only land use finance, provided a baseline of existing domestic and international spending on climate prior to the implementation of their climate change policy. Indonesia is currently in the process of updating this landscape to track progress since then. The work also led to the development of a budget tagging system at the Ministry of Finance. Other countries, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, are currently preparing to use the land use finance tool to track implementation of their REDD+ investment plan and inform donors. Our methodological approach to analyze the financial flows in activities and sectors related to land use, and particularly the potential impact on forests, is based on traditional budget review approaches, but aims to provide additional insights to inform policy development. CPI originally developed climate finance mapping in 2011 to track global financial commitments to climate action and to help evaluate the progress in climate financing against NDC needs. In this map, you can see in orange countries which have conducted finance mapping related to climate change, and in green, those countries who have or are in the process of using this tool to map land use finance more specifically. So I'm now handing over to my colleague Angela for a detailed introduction to the tool.
Thank you, Adeline, and hello everyone. My name is Angela Falconer from Climate Policy Initiative. It's great to see many familiar names on the line today and new colleagues from around the world. Before I dig into the details of the tool, let me first say a special thanks to Adeline and colleagues at European Forest Institute for a very productive collaboration over the past years on the land use finance work, and now helping to make our methodology available online in an accessible format for practitioners to use. Many thanks also to the CPI team and consultants who have helped develop all of the material and supported the process until now. So The tool, the Land Use Finance tool, takes the form of a website where you can view or download a PDF containing the complete guidelines with case study templates, as well as 10 Word and Excel files containing helpful checklists, draft frameworks, and a database template which we hope will help provide some shortcuts for scoping and data collection should you decide to develop your own mapping of land use finance. I'll introduce you briefly to the different modules in the tool without going into too much detail today, but all the information is available at landusefinance.org. The objective of the tool is to support countries, regions and jurisdictions who wish to conduct an analysis of land use finance. It provides a standardized approach to land use finance mapping and analysis which can be tailored to specific needs and objectives. It's based on lessons and experiences from land use climate finance mapping in Indonesia, Côte d'Ivoire, Vietnam and Papua New Guinea, PNG. The plan is to improve the tool iteratively over time, building on implementation experiences. Here you can see an overview of the 8 modules included in the tool. Each module represents a step involved in developing a land use climate finance mapping exercise. Steps can be approached in a linear way or independently or iteratively. So, Module 1, Scoping the Mapping Exercise. The project scope will clarify what needs to be included in the land use finance mapping, what should be excluded and why. It's important to gather as much information about the context and purpose of the analysis so that the scope can be clearly developed, as this will save time and resources in the long run. However, it's very likely when developing the analysis further, the project team will have to readjust the scope based on newly received information on financial flows and activities, and indeed data availability. The scope of the analysis should be discussed with key stakeholders and your project champions, perhaps within key ministries or organisations. On the website, you'll be able to find a scoping template including some suggested questions you may consider when defining your scope. These questions might be, for example, what is your reference policy framework that you want to base definitions and the analysis on? For example, you could frame it around your national climate change strategy or a sectoral policy or strategy that's targeted at a specific driver of deforestation or specific supply chains. Are you interested only in green or climate-aligned finance, or also the broader financial flows, which are so-called grey or brown flows? What geographic scope or scale do you want to focus on? What period or timeline do you want the analysis to cover? The most recent year for which data is available, or even forward-looking to consider planned spending? And on that, do you want to cover expenditures or disbursements or commitments? Which sectors are of particular interest? And which sources or actors do you want to include, public and private, domestic and international, for example? Of course, in all of this around scope, key considerations are the timeline within which you want to complete the analysis, if there's some key milestones, what budget and skills are available in the team. Moving on to Module 2, Stakeholder Engagement. This is essential for every step in the process to create ownership and buy-in for the land use finance mapping results, to facilitate access to good quality data, to translate findings into policy recommendations. It's important to understand which stakeholders are key for the analysis, and therein which individuals and departments are best to engage in the analysis. For example, when contacting a sector ministry, it's often necessary to be introduced formally through an interministerial letter. Ideally, you would therefore have one ministry on board as a project champion, which can facilitate those kinds of access to data. On the website, you can find templates to help design a stakeholder engagement plan and log contacts. Moving on to Module 3, the definition. Developing a robust, detailed and broadly accepted definition of land use finance is absolutely central to carrying out land use finance mapping. Definitions should be nationally or locally specific and related to policy objectives where possible. Developing a definition usually requires extensive consultation with key officials and experts. Ideally, existing definitions can be built upon and adapted where necessary. This will entail specifying relevant sectors and activities that are in scope and developing detailed typologies and approaches to guide the assessment of alignment of individual projects and programs found in the financial data with jurisdictional or national policy objectives. Here we see an example of a climate relevant definition, which was developed for a study, land use finance mapping, carried out in Papua New Guinea. In this study, 3 classifications were adopted based on national discussions and a desire to highlight aligned, conditionally aligned and misaligned land use activities. In Côte d'Ivoire, however, only 2 categories were used, climate aligned and conditional, which you saw on the slides, the initial slides from Adeline, were represented by grey and green flows respectively. Of course, context is really key here to understanding if specific activities are in line with particular policy objectives. This requires a detailed understanding of land use pressures and the activities implemented by the project or programme. This often then requires consultation with experts who are familiar with projects, or at least consultations on detailed qualitative project information. Moving on to Module 4, the mapping framework. This module focuses on developing a first plan and visualization of the framework for the mapping of land use finance flows. In this step, the team will put all of the elements together and develop a first qualitative visualization of the potential final output. This will help confirm the scope with the project champion and key stakeholders, including the dimensions and categories to be used in the analysis. Here we see a simplified template of the potential dimensions and categories you may wish to represent in your analysis. Previous examples of our land use and climate finance mapping exercises have shown a snapshot of the life cycle of finance, thereby clearly distinguishing the sources where the money originates from, the instruments used to channel money, the actors through which money is channeled, and the activities that money is spent on. In the mapping process, the project team should agree on which of these horizontal headings should be included and the set of vertical categories that you're aiming for. These categories can then be applied when the data is processed. Module 5 looks at data collection. With the project scope and framework already defined, the team can focus on data collection efforts in support of the analysis. There are 2 different categories of data needed, which are equally important for every climate finance mapping. First of all, quantitative financial data at the project, programme, budget line is the basis for the final financial mapping. Qualitative information, however, is also essential for understanding the land use context within the geography or jurisdiction of interest, and to feed into recommendations to be made on the basis of the analysis. For tips on where to find data for each group of actors, public and private, a template available on the website outlines potential data sources and key things to look out for based on our experience to date. The guidelines also discuss data quality concerns in detail, with tips on how to check if data is complete, up-to-date and consistent. Module 6 looks at how to clean, consolidate and classify data. At this stage you would have collected different sets of quantitative and qualitative data from different sources. Datasets to be included must be cleaned and formatted so they can be consolidated in one spreadsheet or uploaded into a database that is set up in accordance with the mapping framework that you established in Module 4. As part of our land use finance tool, we've developed an Excel database template which can be used and modified to gather all the collected datasets in one place and categorize the information. Common challenges after consolidating different datasets into one spreadsheet may include, for example, variation in dates, formats, names, and categorizations. Another key concern is ironing out double counting issues when you bring together data from different sources. For example, if you're looking at international donor projects, they may be recorded on government budgets in some cases, and we want to make sure that those flows are not counted twice. All data needs to be categorized, applying the land use finance definition and typology developed at earlier stages. This would involve classification of budget lines, activities and programs and projects into categories around climate aligned, misaligned and conditionally aligned, for example, or whichever categories you have decided are necessary for your analysis. Moving on to Module 7, Data Analysis and Presentation of the Data. Once you've cleaned, assessed and brought together all of the information from different sectors, the qualitative and quantitative analysis you present should link back to the original objectives and initial questions behind the land use finance mapping. Key aspects you may wish to consider and analyse includes, for example, assessing how much land use related finance is flowing within the region and the period of interest. Who provided the finance and how much was provided? How much was delivered through each financial instrument? What were the main channels or organisations involved in implementing land use related finance? Which sectors and activities was the money used for, and how does that relate to the strategy that you're looking at as to whether key sectors are really covered well or less well. Here we can see some examples of representations of the data from previous studies. So you can present information in tabular format or via a Sankey diagram. The Sankey diagram is in the bottom left, where you can see the flows of finance represented by the thickness of the lines. And what's aligned or not aligned with the colour coding. But you can also see other representations using bar charts, pie charts and tree maps. It's advisable to reach out to key advisors and experts when you're pulling together and drawing out recommendations and conclusions from the analysis to ensure that messaging and communications are put in the right context and interpreted in the correct way. Finally, Module 8, using the results. Of course, we don't want your analysis to sit on a website or on a shelf. We want it to be used by policymakers and decision makers. As shown by Adeline at the beginning of the presentation, in examples from Côte d'Ivoire, Vietnam and Indonesia, one of the common uses of finance mapping data is to measure progress against existing goals and targets. Data from land use finance mapping can also be used to highlight funding gaps to reach policy objectives or targets. It can therefore make the case for new or scaled up interventions targeting specific investment actors using specific instruments in different sectors or activities. It's important to maintain engagement with key stakeholders throughout the mapping exercise as you're carrying out the analysis to identify barriers and opportunities to increase finance for sustainable land use or in order to green certain financial flows and activities. essentially understanding the stories and the narrative behind the numbers and trends. This will help to develop guidance on integration of safeguards or activities in budgets and programming. It could help to develop incentives to make sustainable investments attractive to the private sector, to work also on identifying or developing financial mechanisms and instruments to leverage or redirect greater amounts of finance to aligned activities, and to work on broader policy reforms. So with that, we've reached the end of the overview of the 8 modules of the tool. A lot of information. As I say, there's more detail available on the website, in the guidelines, and in the individual templates. The mapping tool is designed to be an iterative process. The modules were developed to be flexible to help adjust to your own objectives. In general, there's 2 key elements of the implementation of the land use finance mapping tool. First of all, data, access to data, collection of data, analysis and consolidation. This is important because the access to different data sources and types is key in deciding and setting the scope of the analysis. Secondly, the stakeholder engagement strategy. Cooperation and collaboration of key stakeholders for validation and of analysis and results is key. So with that, we're now going to turn over to questions and answers session, and we'd invite you to put your questions, if you haven't done so already, into the box at the bottom right of your screen. We will just take 2 minutes to gather questions before we start responding. So in the meantime, thank you very much for joining today and listening to this overview of the tool. I hope it's inspired you to take a look at the website and consider doing this kind of activity yourself. And we look forward to see your questions now.
Everyone can hear me. We'll move on to the Q&A session. So thank you very much, Angela, for the detailed presentation of the toolbox and the different modules. And thanks to everyone for starting to gather quite a lot of interesting questions. So I will start with answering the first question, which comes from Cameroon. So thank you, Jean-Henri Tsongo-Awona, for your 2 questions. The first one being, after that meeting, after that webinar, what actions can lead us to experience, to use the land use tool, and how can we access information? And more specifically, Jean-Henri is also asking how he could support the implementation of this tool in Cameroon. So, as Angela explained, basically the rationale behind creating this tool was to be able to provide to a broader audience access to the methodological approach, experiences, case studies, and lessons from specific experiences in Asia and in Africa. So EFI and CPI are providing these detailed guidelines on the landusefinance.org website, where you will be able to find the different modules as well as the detailed guidelines, the different templates Angela has talked about, which are editable and then can be used for your own work. The EREDD facility and CPI will also maintain a community of practice around this work, with the idea of providing limited technical backstopping to countries and partners which are willing to use this tool, but also extracting lessons learned from different experiences, helping to improve the tool over time, and maintain and improve the tool and add additional modules perhaps in the future as well, based on experiences and needs from the different countries. The tool is available on the website in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish, and might be developed in future other languages in the future based on the needs and potential partnerships with organizations. How to develop and start the use of the tool in a specific country like Cameroon? Well, it all depends on, I would say, first the objectives of the use of the tool. So I will invite Jean-Henri to have a first detailed look at Module 1 of this tool, which is about scoping, to be able to really define what the objectives are and understand which actors and key players would need to be involved in this type of study. And in Module 2, one can understand, as Angela has explained, who are the main project champions and stakeholders that need to be involved in this type of analysis, to be able to access data, ensure that this analysis fits into a specific policy processes and can lead to a change of behavior, to influence policy, and to inform cross-sectoral coordination. So there's first an assessment to be done in terms of the objectives and the actors to be involved, and then pitching basically the need and the usefulness of this type of analysis to these actors. Moving to our second question.
Adeline, I can come in to answer one of the questions here on resource requirements.
Absolutely. So that was a question that we got from, I'm just trying to find the name of our participant. From Marco Boscolo.
Yeah.
The question was, what is the level of efforts in terms of time and resources needed to go through all the models, and is it possible to do it without project support?
Great. So thank you very much for the question. This is highly variable depending on the ease of data collection and stakeholder engagement in your region or in your country, and depending on the complexity of the scope of work that you want to go for. So you can really tailor to start at least at a first stage. So you can see from the work that we did in Côte d'Ivoire and Indonesia, we started with a focus on the public sector. And that work spanned over a period in Côte d'Ivoire of 9 months. In Indonesia, it was a little longer, around a year. And you'll find in the guidelines we have some information on the resource requirements. We had up to about 420 person days involved in Indonesia, for example, to carry out that work. But it does really depend on the ease of gaining access to data and how large a scope you want to focus on, and the skills available in the team. As to whether you require support to do this work, we've really developed this tool and tried to be very detailed in the guidelines and provide as many templates as possible so that countries and consultants operating in countries would be able to replicate this kind of analysis alone. And in terms of the skills and experience that might be needed, it's really firstly, familiarity with public and private financing needs in land use sectors, familiarity with public policies related to agriculture and forestry, but also an understanding of the public financial system or private flows if that is in scope. So on the public side, understanding how the budget is structured, what fiscal incentives are key, what private investment vehicles and actors are of interest, and qualitative and quantitative data analysis skills. But to reassure you, it's certainly not rocket science, I would say. It's quite straightforward data analysis, which requires patience to iron out double counting issues, and key really is also an excellent network of contacts with relevant government departments, with private financial institutions if they are in scope, with other data providers, to be able to gain access to the data and be able to interpret it. So I might pass back to Adeline for the next question.
Thanks a lot, Angela. So we have several questions that are related to the definition work of developing a typology for REDD plus or REDD aligned activities, as well as potentially non-aligned or conditionally aligned activities. And a question around who, by Nicole, for instance, around who is giving input to building this typology and labeling actions as sustainable or unsustainable activities. Also a concern by Andy about seeing, for instance, subsistence agriculture categorized as being climate misaligned. I think that was in the PNG example. So basically, how is this typology being developed at the country level? I will maybe start addressing this question and passing it back to you also, Angela, to share your experience. First of all, I would like to make it really clear that the land use finance tool does not provide a standardized typology of aligned or conditionally aligned or non-aligned activities. This typology really needs to be country developed and country owned, and will very much depend on country circumstances. So in some countries, one activity can be considered as a driver of deforestation, and in another country it might not be the case. So the approach that the land use tool, the land use finance tool, is advocating for is really the development of this typology together with stakeholders. There can be a first assessment done based obviously on the context, on the analysis of the drivers of deforestation. It would all depend on at what stage the country or the jurisdiction is in terms of having the sufficient information basis around these issues, and having discussed and perhaps already reached a consensus around drivers of deforestation, around REDD plus policies and measures, etc. But in our experience, even if I take the example of Ivory Coast, where we've worked in the context of the national REDD plus strategy with clarity around drivers of deforestation, with specific REDD plus policies and measures already elaborated and detailed in the strategy, there was still some significant work and consultations and consensus building needed to be able to clearly detail and understand and categorize activities into these different categories. That's also why in the case of Ivory Coast, as opposed to PNG, where you have seen on that 3 categories in PNG have been created, in Ivory Coast chose to only distinguish investments between aligned and non-aligned, but not necessarily making a direct link with a negative impact on deforestation, but more relating it to uncertainty around the impact of measures. So it's really up to the country to detail and to reach a consensus on this typology, and it can take significant consultation work and efforts to reach that consensus in between different sectors. But I must say that it's also one of the key elements of the use of this tool is that it is a channel to be able to foster this type of discussions in government and with other partners. When you talk about financial flows, when you talk about money and budgets, it certainly raised the attention of stakeholders that you might not necessarily be able to involve in other circumstances on the REDD+ issues, for instance. So it is. We've seen also that it's a good, it has a good convening power to talk about financial flows and typology, and that it can support the general policy process around the mainstreaming of forest and climate objectives in different sectors. So, Angela, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, and I'll try to cover a couple of other questions that have come in related to this. So we have had a question from Nicole about why the input labeling to actions sustainable, unsustainable, and from Andy, surprised to see that subsistence agriculture counted as climate misaligned. So this is really an example that was developed in PNG. The typology was developed nationally to reflect the national context and policies, and indeed subsistence agriculture or agricultural intensification at the other spectrum could be sustainable, unsustainable. It really depends on the context and the particular project or program or activity in terms of the spatial planning around the safeguards that have been taken into consideration. And so these definitions have to be developed at quite a detailed level and then applied carefully, with not only looking at the financial flow information, but detailed qualitative information gathered from experts involved in the activities on the ground. So Caroline, I think, had a similar question about when we mentioned policy instruments for aligning non-green financial flows with sustainable land use objectives. Can we offer some examples of these policy or legal instruments? So some key examples would be safeguards around spatial planning at a national or jurisdictional level to ensure that projects, say, on agricultural intensification do not result in expansion into forested areas. They could be voluntary initiatives around zero deforestation of commodities for involving corporates, but also development partners. So ensuring development partners are not working in silos related to agricultural development, but also considering deforestation reduction objectives as well. Then going back, another question from David, not so much on definition this time, but around the visualization, the outputs from the analysis. What we have used is a Sankey diagram, which has proven to be a very helpful and captivating representation or snapshots for a specific year. It does indeed get difficult with that representation if you want to be more dynamic and show trends over different years. But we have been carrying out this kind of analysis of climate finance flows for several years at the global level now in Climate Policy Initiative, and you can see on our website some of that analysis where we're looking at the trends over multiple years, I think over 6 years now. And so we have alternative ways of showing that information, but not within a Sankey diagram, which would get complicated. That is quite helpful for the 1 year perspective, where you can also compare to investment needs as well. So I think I'll hand back to Adeline if you'd like to pick up some other questions, Adeline.
Sure, thanks, Angela. So we have a question from Alejandra, who's asking how to manage or deal with sectors with potential impact of deforestation during the study, and the fact that sometimes certain ministries or sectors might not be particularly happy about this kind of analysis, and could be against the results. So I think that's a very relevant question, and it's one of the challenges around this type of study. One thing that is very important to define as part also of the scoping aspects and the stakeholder engagement approach is to clearly identify what the incentives are for the different partners to engage into such a study, and these incentives will be very different from one ministry to another. So clearly, for a Ministry of Environment or Forestry, for instance, the incentives could be to increase their budget for forest and climate objectives by demonstrating the need for more sustainable finance, by demonstrating, by identifying the gaps that hinder them from achieving their objectives, and these sectors can really use this type of analysis as an advocacy tool within government to make the case for either increased domestic spending on sustainable land use or in their relationships with donors. For other ministries, such as Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Budget or Economics, this kind of analysis can help increase their financial accountability, their financial tracking and budgeting systems, the visibility in terms of allocation of different financial flows, and with the hope of aiming towards higher efficiency as well. And as Alejandra was pointing out, to contrast, like ministries which might be responsible for part of the deforestation in a country, such as ministries of agriculture, of infrastructure, etc., might be a bit more difficult, to engage. But the question is really finding the right incentives for these ministries to engage. They might also be interested in understanding how they can capture additional sources of finance. They might be interested in increasing or valuing their efforts in terms of deforestation or land use safeguards. So the challenge really there is to understand through which angle these ministries can be approached, as well as getting a strong buy-in and leadership from cross-cutting ministries such as finance or even at a higher level to be able to engage various sectors. In some countries, such as Vietnam, it has been very challenging to integrate or to involve in the study a broad range of ministries or all the different sectors which are involved into land use. So an alternative approach, in case this is being really difficult, is also to narrow the scope. In Vietnam, for instance, the analysis that was done in the Central Highland region, when it was coming to analyzing and track and identifying these flows of finance potentially driving deforestation, was limited to the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Agriculture. So it was a first start, and well, agriculture being the main driver of deforestation in that region anyway. Some interesting findings were being able to be drawn from there. So it could also be a stepwise approach to maybe first demonstrate or make the case for the usefulness, the utility of such approaches to be later broadened to more actors. We have another question from Carlos, Angela. So maybe I can leave that for you to answer, and that could be potentially our last question as we are getting towards the end of this webinar. Carlos is asking, considering that REDD Plus is a mechanism for non-Annex 1 countries to receive payments from Annex 1 countries, how an analysis of domestic land use finance can support REDD Plus?
Yeah, very good question. So this exercise really helps to understand what finance is coming in from outside, from donors or philanthropic organizations, NGOs, into the country or jurisdiction, but also to show domestic efforts. We know, as in all sectors, including the land use relevant sectors, private and domestic finance are going to be key to achieving objectives. So international donors and programs really want to see those efforts and how they can best catalyze the efforts on the ground domestically as well. So when you're putting together a proposal for access to funding, this kind of exercise can be very useful to justify what finance is needed and how that finance is going to be really key in a larger picture to green the existing investment in agriculture and forestry. So for instance, GCF provides funding to countries for the implementation of the REDD Plus mechanism, and is increasingly requesting information on land use finance and coherence of its, to understand how its own funding fits into the broader national picture. So this can be helpful for mobilization. I think there was a practical question of bringing data together from different online databases and international information. Indeed, this is a challenge and involves some recategorization to align different definitions and bring that together into the ones that have been developed in your own framework. So with that, I think I'll pass back to Adeline to conclude, given that we're just out of time.
Thanks a lot, Angela, and thank you very much for your very good questions. I think now we've reached the time, the end of our webinar. We have been able to answer quite a lot of your questions, but maybe not all. In all cases, we will be uploading in the coming days a Q&A section in our landusefinance.org website, and we will be using all your questions as guidance to inform that section. So you, in case you haven't had a clear answer during this webinar, you'll be able to consult to look at that page as well. Also, please get in touch with us, with the EU REDD facility and CPI if you have any specific bilateral question. We're also very keen on getting your feedback on the tool, if you are planning on using it, or if you are looking more specifically in specific modules, as we are really much aiming to also improve it over time based on your feedback and based on different countries' experiences in using it. So you can get in touch with us by writing directly to us, as well as through the website. There is a contact section in which you can write to us as well. So on behalf of the EU REDD facility and CPI, thanks again for joining us today for this webinar. We hope you found it useful and that you will be able to use those resources if they are of interest to you. And let's wish us a very nice weekend. Thank you very much and goodbye.